First Timothy chapter 5. And since Jack isn't here, we're going to correct everything that he went over. No, I'm just kidding. Jack did a great job. We covered verses 1 through about, I think we got through verse 8. We covered verses 1 through 8. And I just kind of want to do a review of that section, because what we're doing today is kind of a continuation of that as we look at widows and widows indeed, and widows who are to be enrolled, and what in the world does that mean? And we'll get to that. Before that, this photo looks really random, and I honestly forgot I put it in the PowerPoint, but that's all right. Today, just so you guys know, it was fun. We did the teen class at 1:30, and we're going through Ecclesiastes, and we kind of broke out into rooms, and I had them draw pictures. We had them draw pictures, Scott Beyer, Chris Huntley, and myself. And believe it or not, this was pertinent to the study we were doing. But I just wanted to show you guys that we had a lot of fun, and we're going through Ecclesiastes. We went through Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 today. And we had like over 20 people involved in that. And they were from, Texas and from California, Washington, Oregon. I think we had some from Idaho. And so we got a really good turnout for that. And that's been a lot of fun. So if you have teens, we're going through Ecclesiastes. You can, get in contact with me, and I'll send you the Zoom ID. And we'd love to have them join us as we go through the book of Ecclesiastes. So there's been some positives that have come out of all this. And this is, for me, this is one of them, is getting to study with different preachers and get to study with different teens from various areas and establish relationships that way. So that was a lot of fun. But going back to First Timothy, as I said before, Jack covered verses 3 through 8, and really that study started in verse 1, but we were emphasizing verses 3 through 8 last week. And we talked about, widows, those who are widows, as opposed to those who are truly widows. And what is that all about? And for starters, in verse 3, we were told that we are to honor widows. And you look up that word, and it's this idea to provide for the needs of, as a sign of respect. So when we talk about honoring widows, we're talking about, taking care of them, valuing them to the point where we're not going to let them, go on in lack and having a need. And this would have been very important for them back then, because nowadays it's a little bit different society, a little bit different culture. But in those days, if your husband passed away, you're in big trouble. It was hard to make money as a woman without the help of a husband. That was just the way that the culture was set up. And so in the church, God established it and wanted to have it so that these women, they wouldn't be in need, and that they would be taken care of. This is a way in which, God's church and God's people could be a light in the world, showing the world, hey, we take care of those who aren't able to take care of themselves. And so they're told to honor widows who are truly widows. And then we ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to be truly a widow? And I want to go back, but that's clarified in verse 5. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, right? That's the idea, that she's left all alone. She not only has a spouse that has passed away, but she doesn't have anyone to take care of her. She doesn't have any children. She doesn't have any relatives, any family. And so she's left all alone. And so she's what Paul refers to as a widow indeed. And it says that she's to set her hope on God and continue in supplications and prayers night and day. And I think that'll be important as we continue this study. But what we were left with is a very strong statement in verse 8 that says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I was just kind of on the sidelines in the study last week, but one thing I was saying and what I was thinking is that's got to be one of the strongest statements in all of the New Testament, that if you don't provide for your own relatives, and of course the specific context here is taking care of widows that are your family, then you've denied the faith and you're worse than an unbeliever. Well, why is that? It's because you know the right thing to do and you choose not to do that. But it goes even beyond that, because taking care of widows, taking care of those lives that you're responsible for and those that are dependent on you, is it goes back to something that was central for God's plan and God's will for his people. And so again, that idea, it's to provide for. That's what we're supposed to do, or to provide, and that's to think about beforehand in a solicitous manner to care for, provide for someone. You're thinking of ways, and you have this person on your mind, but it's more than that. You're putting in forethought to think of ways that you can take care of them and provide for them. And so we talked about, of course, material provisions, but not only that, being there for them emotionally and by their bedside when they're sick and things of this nature, not leaving them all alone. And so this goes back, as I said, to kind of this core thing of God's plan. And so that's why he says you're worse than an unbeliever. When you look up the word widow, this is the very first command that God gives to Israel concerning widows. He says in Exodus chapter 22, the book of Exodus, this is right when Israel is becoming a nation. So this is the start of God's kingdom. He says, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will burn. Was taking care of widows, taking care of those who were unable to help themselves, was that an important thing, and has it always been an important thing to God? Yes. And so when you look at his church and when you look at the commands of Jesus, that, the most important one is to love God, but then love your neighbor as you love yourself. To neglect taking care of widows is to neglect, really the full implications of love. I see that somebody has a comment. Brad, try and unmute you here. Yeah, if you could do that. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. It reminds me, so many people in our country today want to talk about religion. Mm-hmm. What's your religion? Mm-hmm. Which is really the wrong thing to discuss. But James does use that word in the first chapter, in verse 27, talking about pure religion or true religion. Mm-hmm. Is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unstained from the world.
Yeah, so, and that word "visit," of course, is much stronger than the idea of just.
It's like the word. It's like the word honor here. It's take care of them.
Yes, exactly. I appreciate that.
It's almost the old medieval mythical knight's code of taking care of those who can't take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, and especially again, it goes back to the culture of that day. They didn't have the ability to go out and make money the way that many of us and many women have the ability to do now. So appreciate that. And so you see, this is a core, this is a core thing for God's people, for God's will. Not only that, you go back and you look at one of the 10 commandments says, honor your father and your mother. If you're the child of a widow and you're obviously an adult and you're in the position where you're capable of taking care of them, we have a response. This is one way that we honor them. This is one way that we honor them, is by taking care of them in their old age when they're unable to take care of themselves. It's this core teaching. And, I can think of a particular situation where there were some people that were getting ready to retire, and they lived close by to their mom, and they decided to retire and move far away from their mom. And I remember getting a call because she had fallen and she needed help. And it's just kind of interesting how that worked out here. They retire and they do something that is better for them as far as from a material standpoint and enjoying life standpoint. But they do it at the expense of shirking this responsibility to honor and to take care of, their parents, and in this case, the widowed mother. And so this is something that we ought to take extremely serious. Again, it's one of the Ten Commandments. It's repeated again in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 2. We're to honor our father and our mother. And then, this is what it said. This is what is said of God. He's father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. This is part of who God is. It's so amazing to me when people try to say that the Bible doesn't respect women. I mean, when you see things like this, it's clear that Israel and the laws that were given to them, they were a standout as far as elevating women to where God wanted them to be. God had a high regard and respect for women to the point where it was abominable for them to be neglected. And when you go to Isaiah chapter 1, one of the things that Israel is rebuked for is for not hearing the cause of the widow. They are neglecting the widow and the fatherless. And so this was something that was a big deal to God. And when Israel failed to do it, they were judged for it. I see somebody has a comment there. Let me open that up. Oh, James 1:27. Yeah, thanks, Brad. James 1:27, true religion. I think I got that one late. But yes, this is a core teaching and always has been a core thing for God and his people. So we look at that and we look at the importance of honoring widows and widows who are widows indeed, and taking care of those in our family who are widows. But then we move on and we're looking at a topic that still involves widows, but is slightly different. In verse 9, it says, "Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband." Let a widow be enrolled. So we talked about widows indeed, and now we're talking about a widow who's enrolled. What in the world is an enrolled widow? Well, it's a widow who's enrolled. I wish it was that easy. But that idea to be enrolled, it means simply this: to make a selection for membership in a group, or in other words, to put on a list. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about a particular group of widows that are 60 years and older that are put on a list. And we're going to see it was a list of widows that were to be, I believe, to be permanently provided for and taken care of by the church. But it kind of leaves us with some questions. Again, what is an enrolled widow? Again, you see in verse 16 that it says, "If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her take care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows." When you're talking about an enrolled widow, this is talking about a group of women that were to be taken care of in all the ways that we talked about, financially, materially, emotionally. They were to be taken care of by the church. Now, this leaves us with a couple questions. First of all, is it somebody who is permanently a widow? In other words, is it somebody that is never going to marry again? And we'll kind of deal with that. But then thirdly, this is kind of an interesting one, and one that has recently come to my attention. There's a belief among scholars that there was an office, a particular dedicated office of widows, and that this was more than just a group of women being taken care of, but that they were also set aside to do specific service amongst the church. And to be honest with you, scholars, I'm finding more and more, they get into just a lot of vain discussions, and we're going to see that whether or not it's an office is really a moot point when we get to the qualifications, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And so here are the qualifications. In verse 9, again, it says, "Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work." So maybe the first qualification that we look at is the most obvious, is that she obviously has to be a widow. It's somebody that has had a spouse that has lived and has passed away, and they're left as a widow. But beyond that, they're not to be less than 60 years old. Why 60? Well, 60 was kind of the traditional age that marked, old age in the Jewish system. So ladies, those of you who are over 60, I'm sorry, but if you're under 60, scripture tells us that you're a younger widow. So woohoo. But they had to be not less than 60 years of age to be an enrolled widow. And they had to be the wife of one husband. Now, what does that mean? The simplest way to put this, because the word wife and the word husband, it's simply man and woman. That's all it is. And context tells you whether they're wife and husband. But the idea here is that it's a one man woman. In other words, she was loyal to her husband. And maybe she had become a widow before and she married again. But if somebody was married and their first husband died and then they got married again, would that person still be a one man woman? I would say absolutely yes. She's somebody that's dedicated and is loyal and is faithful and is not known, obviously, to be an adulterer. She's a one man woman, similar to that of an elder who is to be a one woman man. But then verse 10 says she has to have a reputation for good works. Now, when you look at that, I want you to think about what we talked about concerning the role of elders. When you look at the role of elders, every qualification is meant to point to one main idea. You want to come out with one kind of man at the end of all of those qualifications. And what is that main idea? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Anybody? Going once, going twice. All right. Oh, there we go. We got somebody put it in there. Above reproach. That's right. Blameless or above reproach. So when you look at the qualification of elders, obviously we take every one of them seriously, but the outcome is what you get is somebody that's above reproach. I look at this statement in verse 10 as being something similar to that. That the qualification for a widow is to be somebody that has a reputation for good works. Now, what follows after this is an explanation, a description of somebody that has a reputation for good works. First off, she's somebody that's brought up children. We talked about earlier on in this class what a great opportunity that is to serve God. Women are so important to this church and to God's church because the future of the church depends on children being raised in a godly house and growing up and remaining loyal to God as they grow up. That is a huge responsibility, and one that falls in large part on a woman because she's spending the most time with them. And so what an opportunity to bring up children in the Lord so that they can serve God as they get older. I saw somebody had a comment there. Let me open that again. Oops. Yeah. Let's see. What if a woman who never married, has no children, and is over 60? You know, that's a really good question. I would have to say I don't want to speak to that right now because I guess I haven't really thought about that enough to come out and make a hard and fast answer. But everything that you read here, it's a widow. So it's somebody that was married, that had a husband that died, that was the wife of one husband, that brought up children. Every indication you get is somebody that was married and had kids. But I wouldn't come out and make necessarily a hard and fast answer on that, Brad. Let's see. Kevin and Erica raised hand. Let's see here. Yes. Unmute. Go ahead, Kevin.
I feel like the answer to that goes back to the purpose of this passage, and that's helping the helpless. Mm-hmm. So I think if you go back and look at the original purpose for Paul giving guidelines on widows, it's to help the helpless, and I think that answers the question.
Yeah, and you know, when we're looking at this isn't a list of the only people that the church is allowed to take care of. The context is talking about widows, and more than that, we're talking about widows that I think we're going to see are put on like a permanent list to be taken care of. And so Does that mean that those who weren't considered, to be widows indeed never ever received any help from the church? I don't think that that's the intention. But the difference is that these are widows that are being put on a permanent list. And so something like that, somebody that's over 60, of course, they're allowed to be taken care of by the church, but it would be taken obviously on a case by case basis, and is really, I think, at the end of the day, probably a separate topic than what we're talking about here. So that'd be kind of my brief answer, which isn't really an answer, but that's a good question. I appreciate that. But she's brought up children. Secondly, or thirdly, or fourthly, however you want to put that, she has shown hospitality. Hospitality is like to take care of visitors and to welcome them into your house and to be generous to them. And I was thinking about this idea of being hospitable, and here's a picture that's going to seem really random and irrelevant to the conversation. Do you remember that, Natalie? Yes, she's laughing. So when you're talking about being hospitable, when Natalie and I were in Australia, we visited a church, and we were there, and there's this really nice lady, and this was actually the highlight of our trip, but there was this really wonderful lady that went to church there. She was one of the nicest people I ever met. And she didn't know us. I mean, yeah, I was there to preach, but she didn't know us. And then there's also somebody visiting from California. She didn't know them. And she invited us all over, like half the church, over to her house. And she fed us all, and she let us play with her pet llamas that had just recently been shorn. And so, little did she know, she was creating one of the highlight memories of our trip. And she was being hospitable, taking care of us and keeping us fed and welcoming us into her home as if, we weren't strangers at all. And what's crazy about that is every single one of us, if we could open up the chat, every single one of the people here that have been a Christian for, any length of time, they have a story like that. And this is the type of woman that is being described here as far as hospitable goes. Do you realize how underestimated that is? And I think we sometimes take it for granted that you can go to church. It seems like anywhere there's some sweet lady that's going to invite you into her home, even though she has no idea who you are and has never met you, but treats you like your family. And that's being a Christian. That's following the example of Christ, and it's an amazing thing. And so when we're talking about being hospitable, that's what I thought of. But you go and you continue in verse 10. It says that she's washed the feet of the saints. Now, what is meant here? And I want to ask somebody specific. How about I don't know. How about Steve? Steve, you want to unmute yourself and tell me what it means? Or are we talking about just simply a woman that washes feet, or is there something deeper going on here? See if I can find him on here. Oh, maybe Steve is on YouTube. So I'll ask Dave Larson. How about Dave Larson? Dave Larson, are you there? You want to?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So it tells, it's describing this widow as somebody that's washed the feet of the saints. What's meant there? Is it just somebody? Should all our widows go around washing feet now, or what?
No, that's not the impression there that I get at all. It's just like when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, he was showing an act of service. And that's what he's requiring. And that's what the widows did. They serve, and they're there to serve. And so they're ready to serve if asked upon, and they're there also to serve when they see opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly, it's to serve. And they're serving in ways that probably aren't the most popular. I'll never forget when I was at camp, and I shared the story when Paul Hawthorne was on our Friday, South Salem talk. But I remember when I was a kid, Paul Hawthorne, he was teaching that section from John 13. And he asked, and as he was teaching through it, he asked which one of us, here we are at camp, it's dusty, we're smelly, we're gross. And he asked which teenage boy wants to have their feet washed. And somebody raised their hand, and he sat there and washed their feet while he was teaching from that section. And, washing feet back then when they're wearing sandals and it is dusty in Jerusalem and Israel, and they're walking around all day. It's not a job that that people want. But that's the kind of woman that you have here, that she's going to serve, and she's going to do it in ways that that other people wouldn't always want to do. She's going to do the things that nobody wants to do, and she's going to do it because she realized there's a need there, and she has the opportunity to serve. And so that's the idea. She's humble, and she does what nobody else sometimes wants to do. And finally, we're told that she's someone that's cared for the afflicted. And I can think of people here at this congregation where, we have Ruth Carroll, we have shut-ins, and there's people that have other struggles. And I can think of several women that come to mind that they're the first ones to call them, or to cook and bring a meal to them, or to sit by their bedside. This is the type of thing that's being described here. And so what you're end up with is a woman that's devoted herself to every good work. And so again, there's this idea in scholarship that it's they ask all the time, oh, this was an office, that you had elders, deacons, and then you had widows. And I don't know about all that. But what I'll say is that it's really kind of a moot conversation, because what you have in the end is someone that is devoted herself to every good work. In other words, she doesn't need an office. She doesn't need the church to tell her what to do. And if she was the type of person, she's the type of person that is already doing all of these things. And now she's somebody who's being put on a list to be taken care of by the church. Do you think the woman being described here is going to say, all right, now I can lay back and take it easy? Or is the type of woman being described here going to say, this is all the more reason for me to serve God and to serve my brothers and sisters in Christ, and to serve in whatever way I can? I think the type of woman being described here is that one, that she doesn't need an office to tell her to go and do these things. She's already doing them. She has a reputation for good works. And so that conversation, it's kind of, I guess I don't really necessarily see the point of it. And so, it's interesting. You look at this and we break all these things down. For men, myself included, I look at the qualifications for an elder. And I know that there's probably many people here that look at the qualifications for an elder, many men here that have looked at that their entire lifetime and have thought, okay, not only is that a qualification for elders, but it's an outline of the type of man that all of us should be. And we look at that and we go through the list and we say, okay, I may not be an elder one day, but I still want to be this kind of man. And so we aim for that, and it's kind of on our goal board. We have all these various things, and if we have a weakness along the lines of those qualifications, we want to improve it, and we're constantly growing towards that. Okay, and so we look at that. Now, what kind of goals should a woman have? And I think that this list for widows, it serves in a similar manner, that she should be a one-man woman, faithful to her husband, that she should have a reputation for good works, that she should bring up children and instill the word of God in them, that she is hospitable, bringing strangers into her home, feeding them, that she washes the feet of the saints. She's the humble servant. She does the things that not everybody wants to do. She cares for the afflicted, which, by the way, isn't always something that we want to do, is it? It's sometimes hard to sit next to somebody who's dying, but they do it because they know that it's something that needs to be done. Finally, it's somebody that's just devoted to every good work. You think about Galatians chapter 6 and verse 13, it says, as we have opportunity, do good to all, especially to those of the household of faith. They're the type of person that they don't let the opportunity pass them by, that if they have the opportunity and the ability, they acknowledge they have the responsibility, and they take advantage of it. And they do it all knowing that they're not necessarily always going to get praise from man, but they're doing it because, well, their Father who sees in secret will reward them. They're laying up treasures in heaven. And so if you're a woman, a young woman right now, this is a life well lived, and God will reward you for that. And, you know, your husband, your spouse may die before you do, and the church will take care of you. God is happy to take care of this type of a woman. And so that's a life well lived. Yeah, Brad Simmons, let me get to you here. Hold on. Yeah, Brad? Did we get him?
Got me?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. And I know Paul's writing to Timothy and behavior and within a church and so forth, but as I look at our society and where we go today, and as I deal with young people and on usually a daily basis, just ended, thankfully, year's done. This is not the message that is getting taught to young people by society.
Yeah.
It's not I'm thankful the school I work at has been trying to emphasize service. But this is not the message that society and culture is trying to teach young people. It's look out for yourself, take care of yourself. Don't worry, you know, and go for everything you've got and grab it, because no one's going to give it to you. And as one point, the other point is as we possibly teach and reach some people in society, we're going to end up with people from broken homes.
Yeah.
We're going to end up with people who don't have family that take care of them and this sort of thing. And so this is one of these promises that you can point out, hey, you know, God will take care of you. You may not have physical family to take care of you, but you devote yourself to God and he will take care of you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And unfortunately, all you got to do is go to a retirement home these days, and you can see how neglected our elderly are. And there's a lot of opportunity there to, again, you know, let our light shine and be an example to the world. And if you have younger people, you're raising young women and young men for that matter, take them with you to those situations, because it's eye-opening and you're leading by example that way. And so, yeah, I appreciate that, Brad. I really do. So continuing on here, we changed gears. And so that was who was supposed to be enrolled on this kind of this list of women, this list of widows that were to be taken care of. But now we're told about the type of person in those days who was to be refused. They were to be rejected. And obviously it's not rejected from the church, right? It's simply being not included on this list. And so in verse 11, he says, refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation, because they have set aside their previous pledge. That's really interesting. First off, we're told that, well, I mean, what's a younger widow? In this case, a younger widow is anyone who's, 59 and younger. They're not 60, right? They're not this older widow. But he goes on to say that they're not to be put on the list. And why is that? He says, because when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married. Now, I can't imagine ever losing a spouse. And so I'm not even going to attempt to try and relate to that. But one thing I have seen, if I can speak from that perspective secondhand, is that obviously that's a tragedy. And it's so painful that I would imagine you would never want to even dare to go through something like that again. And so when you first lose a spouse, I would imagine that the first reaction is, I never want to get married again. And so you can imagine how tempting it would be for a younger woman to lose her spouse and then immediately, seek to be put on this list of somebody that's permanently taken care of. But he says, eventually there's going to be this time where their sensual desires they're going to return. When you look at sensual desires, what that really means is it's physical desires. It's likely referring to, sexual desires. He says it's going to lead to this disregard of Christ, to the extent that they're going to want to get married. It's interesting because it's not saying that the sensual desire is going to lead them to fornication. It's saying it's going to lead them to want to get married. Well, what in the world is wrong with that? What's wrong with a woman wanting to get married? And that's where I say that this, before I introduce it, I put a question mark next to it, that these are widows that, my best guess is that, and I'll tell you the other view, is that these are widows that have decided to remain widows. And he's saying that younger women shouldn't be put on this list because they may initially commit to being a widow and setting themselves apart entirely to God. And then all of a sudden, these desires will return and they will go against that initial pledge that they made. I won't turn to it, but in Numbers 30, it talks about women and men making vows. And in one particular verse, I can't remember where it is, like verse 5, 6, or 7, somewhere in there. It talks about how if a widow or somebody who's divorced, if they make a vow, it will stand against them. In other words, if they make a vow, God's taking that seriously, and so should they. And now in verse 12, it tells us that they get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. The word pledge there is pistis, which for those of you who are familiar, that's just faith. In fact, the ESV says that they've abandoned their former faith, I believe. But I think faith is being used in a specialized sense. And you look at a lot of the major translations, and it's the word pledge. You think about that word faith, it's translated in a lot of different ways. It's translated in trust, assurance. So a lot of translators, and you look it up in the lexicon, they believe it's being used in this specialized sense, that the idea isn't that by getting married that they've fallen away from the faith and that's how they're incurring condemnation on themselves. Because if that was the case, you'd have to automatically assume that they're marrying unbelievers or that there's somehow something wrong with them getting married. But in verse 14, he'll go on to tell them to get married. And so it seems that the problem with them getting married is that they're enrolled as widows. And that's the only way, to me, that, when you put verse 14 into the mix, that makes sense to me, that they're incurring condemnations on themselves because they've made this vow to remain a widow and to serve God in all the ways that we talked about earlier, taking advantage of that opportunity to serve God. And then they decide to go back on that and go back on that vow that they've made, to being totally devoted to Christ. And they've set aside or broken that pledge. I see Brad has his hand up. Yeah, go ahead and unmute him for me, Natalie. Yeah, Brad?
Just a question. Is this possibly what eventually became the Catholic Church, where they got the idea for nuns?
Yeah, I suppose it's possible. I haven't looked too much into that, and I was wondering the same thing. But I can't tell you definitively if this is where they get that. Obviously, there's a way to abuse what's being said here. This pledge isn't something. This is something that you can decide to take yourself or not. It's not something that's being imposed upon anybody. But yeah, in short, I don't know if this is solely where they get that. I suppose that it's probably one of the places for sure. But I want to bring out this idea of, they set aside their previous pledge. That's the idea. To set aside, it's to reject something as invalid, to declare invalid, to nullify, to ignore. So you can imagine they've made this pledge and God takes seriously this vow, and then they turn around on it. Well, what have they done? They've invalidated it. They've declared it invalid. They nullified, they ignored that pledge, that vow that they made. And this is used in similar senses elsewhere in the Bible. In Galatians 2 and verse 21, Paul writes, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. But he says, I do not nullify the grace of God. Well, how is he nullifying? Well, he's going back he's talking about this idea of going back to this old covenant, this old agreement that is based off of works rather than grace through faith. And by doing that, by bringing in, a works-based system, you're nullifying this current covenant of grace. And so I think that's kind of the sense that this Greek word is being used here as well. It's the same word for what I have on your screen. They have set aside. And so they're told to refuse younger women because if they are put on this list, then they may and probably will eventually get married anyways. By the way, the other view there that I didn't talk about is that people believe this could be in reference to women marrying unbelievers. And because it was common in those days to marry an unbeliever and then take the man's religion. And I suppose that that's possible, but I don't understand if that's the view. I don't understand why that's a greater possibility if the woman's enrolled as opposed to after her husband has just died, because in verse 14, it says younger women should get remarried. So on one hand, you have Paul, discouraging marriage in verse 11, but then on the other hand, in verse 14, he's encouraging it. And the only way to me that I can reconcile that is if in verse 11 and 12, Paul is talking about a specific pledge that they made that they're going back on. And so if you want to disagree with me on that, by all means, I'm open. I'm not, hard and fast either way on that, but that seems to me to be the simplest explanation. But going on, he says that's not the only issue. At the same time, they also learn to be idle. That word idle, it's like to be lazy. They're not doing anything. And they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips. That is, gossip is silly talk. It's talk that just doesn't amount to anything. It's pointless. It's not edifying. We've all had experience with gossip where we're talking about the lives of other people, talking about them behind their backs, talking about just things that don't matter, that don't promote growth in Christ, but if anything, it disrupts it. Then he says that they're busybodies, which is this idea of like meddling, like you're sticking your nose in somebody else's business. And he says they talk about things that are not proper to mention. Now that's really strong, but there's an underlying principle here that isn't just true for women, but it's true for everybody. And the fact is that men deal with a different set of temptations and issues and sins, and they have certain predispositions. And then women, they have other predispositions and sins that they struggle with at times. And we're speaking in generalities, right? But there's this kind of underlying issue that we want to talk about, but we'll keep reading in verse 14. He says, this is the answer to that problem, right? He says, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. In other words, some are already doing these things that I've just talked about. They're turning aside and they're turning away from God and they're turning to follow Satan. They're idle, they're busybodies, they're meddling in other people's business when it has nothing to do with them. And so this is the answer to get married, to bear children, and to keep house, and to give the enemy no occasion for reproach. And so I said that there's this underlying thing that we want to address, that, and it applies to all of us. And that's this: we want to take away Satan's opportunity. We don't want to give a foothold to Satan to tempt us, to turn us away from God. And so a real kind of basic idea is that an empty life is a life in peril, and a full life is a safe life. In other words, that if we have a woman's life is busy. When she's married, she's busy. When she has children, she's busy. And if that woman, her spouse dies and she doesn't have children, all of a sudden, as tragic as it is, they are alone and they don't have as many things to do. They don't have somebody to talk to. And there's this emptiness left in their life. The idea here is don't leave your life empty. If you're an older woman, dedicate your life to good works. Establish a reputation of good works. Serve whomever you can serve. Serve God. Be totally dedicated to God. And that kind of goes back to 1 Timothy 5 in verse 5 when it talks about she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Those who are truly widows, they've set their hope on God. They're totally devoted to God, and this is how they deal with that void in their life. But those who are younger, Paul, he says they got to get married, they got to bring up children, they got to have a busy life, because the thing is if you have an empty life, you're inevitably going to fill it with something. And in this case, the people that Paul is dealing with, the way they were filling that emptiness was, well, number one, some of them weren't. They were lazy. They weren't doing anything. Number two, they were, if we go back and look at that verse, sorry, let me go back. They were gossiping, talking about things that don't matter. And finally, they were involving themselves in people's business that had nothing to do with them. So they're filling this emptiness in their life in unhealthy ways. Now, we're not talking about men, we're talking about widows, but again, I think it applies to everyone. There's this base application that applies to all of us. A full life is a safe life, a life that's not going to give Satan an opportunity. And as I was going through this, I couldn't help, I have to brag about one man that I'm very proud of. He's the reason why I'm a preacher, and that's my grandpa Lowell. You know, my grandpa Lowell, many of you know that his wife died when he was in his 50s. And it was very tragic. She went in for, you know, somewhat of a routine surgery, and she died on the table. Life-changing, right? Well, how did he respond? He responded by 1 week after he started finding and renting and getting any book that he possibly could get his hands on that had to do with grief. Because he realized that there was this void in the church where there was preachers that talked about grief, but they hadn't really gone through it themselves. And then there's people that had gone through grief, but they weren't, it was hard for them to talk about. So there wasn't a lot of material out there. And so my grandpa, he buried himself into this work. Instead of leaving his life empty, he filled it up with this service towards God. And it's one of the probably the greatest things that he's known for as far as his preaching career. It was his material on grief. He went all over, you know, the West Coast, United States, teaching this material. And I don't want to speak for my grandpa, but I have a feeling that if I were able to ask him why he buried himself and made himself so busy after his wife died, I would imagine it would be because he realized that if he hadn't done that, that he would be in trouble. That he would be giving Satan an opportunity to tempt him to give up, to walk away. But he just decided that he's going to fill his life up with serving God and serving others. And he's an example to me that a full life is a safe life, that he could go through something that tragic and really end up being an even stronger Christian for it. And so that's the idea here, is to fill your life up. And we see that in Luke 11, verse 24 through 26. And he's talking about when an unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest and finding none. It says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings seven other spirits more evil than itself. They enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. Of course, Jesus is talking about demons here, but there's a broad application to this. Whether it's sin, whether it's a tragedy, whatever it is, whatever this bad thing is that has happened to you or you have brought on yourself, what we got to do is, it's not just about, you know, emptying ourselves, but it's about replacing the bad with the good. And the gospel is what empowers us to do that. It empowers us to serve others, to serve our community, to walk in the pathway of Christ, to follow his example. And if we do that, we'll find that we'll have a safe life. So I want to finish with verse 16. This is kind of somewhat related, but a slightly different issue. And I'll probably let Jack talk about this more when he's back. But it says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. And I think that's just kind of the same idea of hey, if you have family, it's our responsibility, you know, if we have family in need, it's our responsibility to take care of them. And it's the same for women. Let her take care of them. But there's this principle here at the end: let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. When you talk about benevolence, for instance, there's this idea that there are priorities when it comes to benevolence, and that is that the greatest need comes first. And so we talk about, again, I brought up Galatians chapter 6 and verse 13, to do good to all, especially those of the household of faith, that when it comes to benevolence, just as an example, our first responsibility of how we distribute our benevolence is those who have the greatest need. So we might do one-time benevolence for somebody that has, quite frankly, bad spending habits, but is it wise to continue to support that lifestyle when there's others that have a greater need? Of course, we wouldn't want to continue doing that. And so when we talk about the church not being burdened, if there's any way in which we are able to keep these problems from burdening the church, if we're able to take care of these as individual, for instance, taking care of our widowed mothers or grandmothers or whatever it may be, if we're able to take on that responsibility ourselves, then the idea is that we're preventing the church from being burdened, so that it can take care of, in this instance, those who are truly widows, so it can address the greatest need.